So the next project I'm going to be working on is a fireplace mantle and surround. And I just want to say right from the beginning of this video will detail how to build this fireplace surround. It will not detail how to install it, and that's just because there's a contractor doing an entire job. I was hired just to make the surround, and he will be installing it. So I won't have details of how to do that, and it's being built to his specifications for how he wants to install it. So I'm working on the plinths right now, and there's going to be a recessed piece in the middle of both of the legs, and that recessed piece is 1/2 inch. So I'm going to be cutting this rectangle based on the dimensions out of the center of this piece of MDF. This is 1/2 inch MDF, so then I'll have my exact recessed depth, and I could glue this to another substrate, and then all the joints on this are going to be mitered, and then miter that substrate. Now the reason I'm going about spending more time cutting out this circle versus just cutting strips and gluing them on something is because since this is going to be around a heat source, I want to really try and build as much as I can out of composites and plywood because they will be the least affected by the relative humidity in the room, which will be affected by the heat source in the room. And you can get away with making these and, filling in gaps down the line with caulk, but the chances of miters or even strips opening up during the winter time when that fireplace is in use is pretty substantial. So I'm going to spend the extra time to make this one solid piece so that no gaps will open up on it. But like I said, you could easily get away with stripping this out and just building it that way. In order to cut out this rectangle, I'm going to cut as much as I can on my table saw, which will be most of these 2 long runs, and then I could hand cut or jigsaw cut out the top parts and a little bit in the corner I can't get. So what I did was these edges are 1 inch, so I set my fence up to make sure that it will cut on the inside of this line, and I put a little tape that corresponds with this line, so I could put this above the blade, line that line up with that piece of tape, and drop it on the running blade and slide it until it reaches the edge. Now if you cut into the back of this a little bit, it's not a huge deal because it's going to have a substrate on the back of it and you won't ever see it. So then I could, after drilling that hole, I could cut this out with a jigsaw. And I'm not going to follow my line, I'm going to follow a little above it just because I've had this jigsaw for quite some time and it really doesn't cut straight no matter what you do. And the nice thing about MDF is I could cut a little bit shy of that line and it's so easy to sand. I could just go back in and then sand it to that line. That's what those finished pilasters look like, and you could see at one end I marked where that plinth block is going to go, and the other end I kept really long because these are going to be 2 legs and they're going to connect to that mantle, and I haven't fully decided how I'm going to do that, so I left it long. These are both 6 inches wide, so I'm going to cut 2 more pieces of that 1/2 inch MDF to laminate to these a little bit wider than that to give me some room for glue up, and then glue both of these together. So with that slab cut, I can now glue these together, and I'm going to be applying glue to the detail piece and then brad nailing it onto this one to secure it. So I'm not going to be putting brads in the two stretches because you'll see those, but where the plinth block is going and where the excess is, you'll never see. So I could put brads in that, and then I could flip it upside down and put brads through the bottom into these verticals. So you're going to want to make sure before you glue this up that your edges are all nice, because it's just going to be much harder to sand when it's on, when it's finally connected than when the back is open. So I had those two front pieces drying for a couple hours, and now I'm going to cut all the sides that will attach to the sides of these. So both edges of these are going to have to be mitered, but I'm not going to do that just yet. I'm going to cut the sides now. I'm using 3/4 inch maple veneer ply for this, and that's mainly because it's what I have around. I use this stuff a lot, so I have a lot of scrap that I could use for this project. I'm keeping these pieces long just like I did the fronts, and I could trim them down later. Now, the sides of this have to be 4 inches, and I'm cutting it on a miter. So I marked 4 inches on the edge of my board. Since this is 3/4 inch plywood, that means the edge of that miter is going to be at 3¼ inches, and the top part's going to be at 4. So I set my fence to 3¼ inches, and I can run this through and get 4 sides. With all those sides cut, I'm now going to cut down the edges of my pilasters to get that final 6 inches with the 2 miters. So since this is 1 inch thick and I wanted it 6 inches, I set my fence to 5 inches. And then since I have all this extra space, I just kind of ran it through to make sure it's going to cut right up to that edge, which it is. So obviously I'm going to send through one of these sides. On both of them is flush, and then one has a little bit of a flange. I'm going to send that flange through first. So all the parts of my pilasters are ready to be glued together, but it's fairly late in the day, and gluing things together tries my patience even under the best circumstances. So usually when it's this late, I just put it off to the next day and everything works out. But I don't want to stop working yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start working on the top part of the mantle. And there's another little detail piece that's going to be made similar to how I made the leg detail, only there's an extra square on either side. So the legs are going to be separate from this top part, and the top part, the total dimension is going to be 15 inches. So I'm going to cut a 1/2 inch piece of the MDF at 15 inches, which will leave it long, and I could trim it down later if I want to. And then I'm going to make this detail piece and glue it onto that 15 inch piece of MDF. So the end dimension for this bigger piece is only going to be about 72 inches, but I cut it to 75 to give me plenty of space to miter both of my ends, because this will be mitered as well. Then on the drawing I'm working off of, there's a 1 inch piece of molding on the top and the bottom of this detail piece. So I drew out 1 inch and then the 8 inches, which is the width of the detail piece, and another line, and then I ripped an 8 inch board there. So now I could place it on top of here and start drawing out that design. I have all my dimensions mapped out for the header of this mantle, and those are obviously based on the drawing, but it's pretty much a 2-inch perimeter around the recessed panels all the way around the piece, and then there's 2 detail squares at either end that line up with the pilasters going downwards, and then obviously I marked out where all my edges are going to be. So cutting this out is going to be very similar to the other details, only I'm going to set my fence at 2 inches in because that's how wide the perimeter is versus 1 inch on the others. And then the 2 detail squares on either end are small enough that I'll probably have to cut those out completely with a jigsaw.
Where that came from this week. 4 times a day. Next chance to win is 240. Jimmy, World's playing this year.
So I've got that detail piece attached, and the next step is going to be to cutting these to final length with miters on the edge to join the sides on the miters as well. But before I do that, I'm going to rip 3/4 of an inch off the top of this piece. So this header for the mantle is going to be 15 inches tall, but that's with an 1.5 inch overhanging mantle slab on the top. Now, I'm not going to make that top piece a solid 1.5 inches, it's just not necessary. So I'm going to make it 3/4 inch plywood. So that 3/4 inch plywood will sit at 14 1/4 off of the bottom. And then I'll just put a false front with miters on the top of that plywood to make it appear like an 1.5 inch slab. But in order to do that, before I start gluing up these sides, I'm going to cut this down to that 1.25 inches, 14 inches and 1/4 inch. So the main difference now between the legs and the header are the legs are all one solid piece over that 1/2 inch MDF. So when I mitered the edges, you have the same depth on all the edges. Now on the header, obviously now the detail work is proud of that 1/2 inch. So if I miter these edges and attach a side, this will stick out past where that side is. So to bring all of this onto the same plane in order to make those miters, I'm going to be adding some pieces of MDF. So on the bottom there's an inch piece, which I'll put there, and then the leftover scrap I had from one of the cutoffs I could put at the top. Now there's going to be a little, this is a little short for the top, but that really won't matter because like I said, up here all the way around you're going to have the top of the mantle, which will cover if there's a little gap in the corner. So I could glue these on there and attach them with brads because there'll be crown molding eventually covering this, and there's going to be 1-inch molding at the top and the bottom of this detail piece which will cover these. So if you put hardware into it, you won't have to worry about patching it. So now that I have these spacers in place, I could start mitering my edges and start forming the shape of this top. Now the top up here I'm not going to bother mitering because the top of the mantle could sit flat on the top and you won't see any end grain on any of these pieces. but on the bottom I'm going to want to miter it because the header is a little proud of the pilasters, and if you see the bottom, anything that you're going to see, the edges, I want them to be mitered so you don't see end grain. Not only that, but the pilasters are actually going to go up into this header, which is how it's going to attach. So you're going to want a piece of wood there to screw some, drill some holes into to attach it. So since this is now 14 1/4 and about 1 inch thick, I moved my fence to 13 1/4 and ran a test cut down the side, and it looks like it's going to cut that miter perfectly. So now I could send this whole piece through. So in order to attach the sides to this mantle header without that edge grain seam, I'm going to be cutting a mitre along the side. So I have multiple marks that tell me where the molding and where the detail work was put in here, but I marked a solid line for my edge. And now I'm going to have to cut this with my circular saw because my table saw just isn't big enough to make these cuts safely. So once I had that, and this is going to be different on all saws, I measured where that 45 cut, which is a different notch than the 90-degree cut, will be to the edge of my fence. And then I set up a temporary fence on my piece with a straight edge and a line. So now I should be able to go through and cut this on a 45. While the depth of my pilasters is 4 inches, the depth of the mantle header is 5 inches. So I have this 3/4 inch birch veneer ply, which I'm going to use to on the sides to get that depth for my sides. So I'm going to cut these to the same height as my header, which is 14 1/4, and then I'm just going to rip that beveled miter edge on the side, and then I could start putting some of these together. I'll also have to cut a piece for the bottom as well as a piece for the top. The piece on the top could be flat, the piece on the bottom is going to be beveled as well. So these pieces are about 6 inches wide, and I'm going to trim them down to 5 inches and cut that miter at the exact same time by setting my fence to 4 1/4, since this is 3 inches, 3/4 inch thick, and sending both of these pieces through. So I have the sides cut for this, and now I'm going to cut that bottom that's going to have that mitered bevel on it to attach to the bottom. Now that's going to be the same thickness as the sides because the legs are going to be inset from the edge, and you'll be able to see from the underside all the way back to the wall. So if that piece wasn't as deep as the sides, you would have a gap. So I have this I've actually been able to make this entire piece pretty much out of scrap from other projects, just because the pieces are so skinny. It's usually about the same size as cutoffs from other larger pieces of furniture. So this is actually a piece I have left over from when I made a torsion box back in around Thanksgiving. So it's 3/4 inch, and it's got the bullnose on the edge, which I'll probably end up cutting off, and I didn't change my fence when I cut my sides, and it's still set up on the 45, so I could just run this piece through, and once I have my side square up, cut the bevels on the end and start attaching this header. So now that I have pretty much all the cutouts for these pieces, I could start gluing stuff together on edge. And for the legs, I'm going to be using a combination of glue and painter's tape. Sometimes I'll put cut splines on the edge of these and splines in the receiving pieces and attach it that way, but I really just don't think that this piece needs that. So it's just going to be mitered butt joints that are going to attach all this together, and then the tape will act as clamps, and that works really well. So I'm going to start with the legs and then kind of move those out of the way and then do the mantle. And the mantle, since I have some spaces where there'll be molding and crown that will cover up the front, I'm going to be using some 2.5-inch finishing nails just for a little more strength since it's such a longer piece. On the legs, since you're going to see the front and the sides, I'm not going to worry with the finishing nails. I don't think you need them. And even though this stuff is really easy to patch and it's going to be painted, it's just that much easier to avoid doing it and not having to patch at all. Now for the header, I'm going to be attaching the sides first and then cutting. I already put one miter on one edge, and then I'll, once this is together, I can get a measurement and cut the other bevel and put that on the bottom. So the bottom is the edge that you really need to square up. The top isn't that big of a deal because the mantle is going to be sitting on the highest part of this anyways. So if this is a little short of that, it's not a big deal. It's the bottom you really want to pay attention to. So my camera died at some point during this glue up, but there's the legs and the header of the mantle drawing. I basically just put the sides on with some tape, reinforced it with some brads, and then put the bottom on, as well as I added this scrap piece of wood I had up top just for some structure, as well as another piece of scrap down at that corner there with some glue for some structure. And minus sanding and a little bit of patching, that worked out pretty well. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to work on the mantle top, which is going to be made out of 3/4 inch birch veneer plywood.